Number 1. Dorothea Puente, the grandmotherly facade that hid a boarding house of death. Born Dorothea Helen Gray in 1929, Puente's early life was marked by trauma and instability, which perhaps laid the foundation for a woman who would eventually master the art of manipulation. By the 1980s, she was operating a large Victorian boarding house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California, where she specifically sought out tenants who were the most vulnerable members of society, including the elderly, the mentally ill, and those struggling with substance abuse. These individuals often had no family to check on them and were entirely dependent on Social Security checks, which Puente would systematically intercept and cash for her own profit. The timeline of her crimes began to unravel in late 1988 when a social worker became concerned about the disappearance of a tenant named Alvaro Montoya, a man with schizophrenia who had suddenly vanished. When police first questioned Puente, she appeared as a kind, elderly woman in a floral dress, but the investigators soon noticed a strange smell emanating from the property and evidence of disturbed earth in the backyard. Upon further investigation, detectives discovered the remains of 7 bodies buried in her garden, most of whom had been drugged with lethal doses of flurazepam before being stripped of their possessions and buried like trash. Puente initially fled during the investigation but was captured in Los Angeles after a man she met at a bar recognized her from news reports. Her trial, which began in 1992, was a sensation that highlighted her sociopathic ability to feign compassion while committing cold-blooded murder for financial gain. The prosecution detailed how she would murder her tenants and then continue to forge their signatures on checks for years, totaling thousands of dollars in stolen funds. Although she maintained her innocence, claiming the tenants died of natural causes and she only buried them because she feared her criminal record for check fraud would lead to trouble, the forensic evidence of drugging was undeniable. In 1993, she was convicted on 3 counts of murder, as the jury deadlocked on the other charges, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente died in 2011 at the Central California Women's Facility, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most chilling examples of a predator who used the guise of a caregiver to prey on those who had no one else to protect them. Number 2. Rodney Alcala, the prolific predator who used the lens of a camera to hunt his victims. Often referred to as the dating game killer due to his 1978 appearance on the popular television show while in the midst of a cross-country murder spree, Alcala was a highly intelligent but deeply depraved individual who targeted young women and children. His background included a stint in the military and an education in fine arts, which he used to cultivate a persona as a professional photographer. This allowed him to lure vulnerable young girls and women into secluded areas under the guise of a photo shoot, where he would then subject them to horrific acts of violence. Alcala's crimes spanned from California to New York throughout the 1970s, and his signature was the extreme level of psychological and physical control he exerted over his victims, often strangling them until they lost consciousness only to revive them and repeat the process. The investigation into Alcala was a long and arduous process, hampered by the primitive forensic technology of the era and his nomadic lifestyle. It wasn't until the late 1970s that he was finally arrested in connection with the 1979 murder of 12-year-old Robin Samso in Huntington Beach, California. During the search of a storage locker belonging to Alcala, investigators discovered a collection of over 1,000 photographs of women and children, many in compromising or distressed positions, which suggested his victim count could be significantly higher than the 8 murders he was eventually linked to. His legal journey was one of the most complex in California history, involving multiple overturned convictions and retrials before he was finally sentenced to death in 2010. During his final trial, Alcala chose to represent himself, leading to bizarre scenes in the courtroom where he questioned his own recorded voice and presented a disjointed defense that further showcased his narcissistic personality. He died of natural causes on death row in 2021, and to this day, authorities continue to release the photographs found in his collection in hopes of identifying other potential victims who may have gone missing decades ago. The case of Rodney Alcala remains a haunting reminder of how a charismatic predator can hide in plain sight, using artistic talent as a tool for destruction. Number 3. John Wayne Gacy, the community leader who concealed a crawl space of horrors. John Wayne Gacy was a man who seemed to embody the American dream in suburban Chicago during the 1970s, serving as a precinct captain for the Democratic Party and entertaining children as Pogo the Clown. However, beneath this respectable exterior was a man who methodically targeted vulnerable young men and teenage boys, many of whom were runaways or looking for work in Gacy's construction business. His pattern was to offer these young men a ride or the promise of a job, only to bring them back to his home in Norwood Park Township, where he would use a trick involving handcuffs to render them helpless. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men, the majority of whom were buried in the crawl space beneath his house, creating a literal tomb underneath his living room. The investigation that finally brought him down began in December 1978 with the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had been doing construction work. When police executed a search warrant on Gacy's home, they were struck by a pervasive, sickening odor that Gacy claimed was caused by a broken sewer line. Further inspection of the crawl space revealed the skeletal remains of victim after victim, packed into the soil with lime. Gacy's arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as the man they knew as a friendly neighbor was revealed to be a monster. His trial in 1980 was a grueling account of his crimes, with the defense attempting to argue insanity, claiming that Gacy suffered from multiple personalities. The prosecution, however, demonstrated the calculated nature of his planning and the cold efficiency of his killings. Gacy was convicted of 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death, an outcome that many felt was the only just conclusion for such unprecedented evil. He spent 14 years on death row, during which he became a macabre celebrity, selling paintings of clowns to the public. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection in 1994, and his case remains a cornerstone of criminal psychology, illustrating the terrifying capacity for a predator to compartmentalize a life of service with a life of unimaginable violence. Number 4, Charles Cullen, the medical professional who turned the hospital ward into a hunting ground. For 16 years, Charles Cullen worked as a nurse in various hospitals throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths in his wake that likely makes him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Cullen targeted the most vulnerable of all, patients who were already hospitalized and often in critical or elderly condition, believing himself to be an angel of mercy while in reality he was a cold and calculating murderer. His method involved the unauthorized administration of medications, most notably digoxin and insulin, which would cause sudden and fatal cardiac or respiratory failure. Because his victims were already ill, their deaths were often attributed to natural causes, allowing Cullen to move from hospital to hospital despite mounting suspicions and several internal investigations. The timeline of his crimes is a staggering indictment of the hospital systems that failed to report their concerns for fear of legal liability. It was not until 2003, while working at Somerset Medical Center, that Cullen was finally caught after 2 colleagues and a determined detective began to piece together the irregularities in the hospital's pharmacy records. Cullen's arrest led to a confession where he claimed to have killed as many as 40 patients, though experts believe the actual number could be in the hundreds. To avoid the death penalty, Cullen cooperated with investigators, detailing the specifics of his crimes and providing some closure to the families of his victims. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms in 2006. The aftermath of the Cullen case led to the passage of new laws in New Jersey and other states requiring healthcare facilities to report suspicious behavior and providing immunity for those who share employment records in good faith. Cullen's case serves as a dark chapter in medical history, proving that even in places meant for healing, a predator can find a way to exploit the defenseless under the guise of care. Number 5, Anthony Sowell, the House of Horrors on Cleveland's Imperial Avenue. Anthony Sowell was a convicted sex offender who, after his release from prison, returned to a quiet neighborhood in Cleveland where he began a 2-year reign of terror between 2007 and 2009. Sowell specifically targeted women who were struggling with homelessness and addiction, knowing that their disappearances would likely be overlooked or attributed to their lifestyle. He would lure these women to his home with the promise of drugs or alcohol, and once inside, they were subjected to brutal assaults and murder. The community had long complained about a foul stench coming from Sowell's residence, which many believed was coming from a nearby sausage factory, but the reality was far more gruesome. The investigation finally broke open in October 2009 when a woman escaped the house and reported that she had been raped and strangled. When police searched the property, they discovered the decomposing remains of 11 women hidden in the basement, the crawl space, and buried in the backyard. The victims were all black women whose families felt the police had ignored their initial missing persons reports, leading to a massive outcry regarding systemic issues of race and class in the judicial system. Sowell was arrested without incident and went to trial in 2011, where he was found guilty on 81 counts, including aggravated murder and kidnapping. The details of the trial were harrowing, as survivors testified about the sheer terror they experienced within the walls of the Imperial Avenue house. Sowell was sentenced to death and remained on death row until his death from a terminal illness in early 2021. The house where the crimes occurred was demolished, but the impact on the Cleveland community and the families of the victims remains a deep scar, highlighting the urgent need for law enforcement to take the disappearances of marginalized individuals seriously. Number 6. Dean Corll, the Candy Man who orchestrated the Houston mass murders. Dean Corll was a seemingly ordinary man who worked at his family's candy company in Houston, Texas, but during the early 1970s, he was the mastermind behind what was then the deadliest serial murder case in United States history. Corll utilized two teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to help him kidnap and torture young boys from the local area. Many of the victims were friends or acquaintances of the accomplices, making them easy targets for abduction. Corll's method was to bring the boys to his apartment or a rented boat shed, where he would subject them to horrific physical and sexual abuse before ultimately killing them and burying them in mass graves. The investigation into the disappearances of these boys was notably stagnant, as police often dismissed them as simple runaways, a tragic oversight that allowed Corll to continue his crimes for years. The spree only ended in August 1973 when Henley, fearing for his own life and the lives of two friends he had brought over, shot and killed Corll during a confrontation. Following Corll's death, Henley confessed to the police, leading them to the discovery of 28 bodies buried in 3 different locations around the Houston area. The sheer scale of the discovery horrified the nation and led to significant changes in how missing children cases were handled. Brooks and Henley were both convicted for their roles in the murders and sentenced to life in prison. The Dean Corll case remains a terrifying example of how a predator can leverage the trust of the youth and the apathy of law enforcement to commit atrocities on a massive scale. It serves as a grim reminder of the importance of community vigilance and the protection of the most vulnerable members of the neighborhood. Number 7. Peter Scully, the international predator who exploited poverty for profit. Peter Scully represents a modern and particularly depraved breed of predator who utilized the anonymity of the dark web to produce and distribute horrific material involving the exploitation of children. Originally from Australia, Scully fled to the Philippines to escape legal trouble, where he began targeting families living in extreme poverty. He would use small amounts of money to manipulate parents into allowing him access to their children, whom he then subjected to unspeakable acts of violence for his global subscribers. The investigation into Scully, known as the No Child's Play case, was a massive international effort involving the Australian Federal Police, the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation, and various global cybersecurity units. The task of tracking Scully was immense, as he used encrypted platforms and constantly moved locations to evade detection. He was finally apprehended in 2015 in a remote area of the Philippines, where investigators found a digital archive of his crimes that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. His trial in the Philippines was a landmark case, resulting in Scully being sentenced to life imprisonment in 2018, with further sentences added in 2022 for human trafficking and the production of illegal material. This case highlighted the devastating intersection of technology and global inequality, where a predator could use digital currency and international borders to hide his activities. It also led to increased international cooperation and funding for agencies dedicated to combating online child exploitation. The legacy of the Peter Scully case is one of profound tragedy but also a rallying cry for global standards in child protection and the pursuit of justice against those who believe they can hide their crimes in the darkest corners of the internet.